was curious about basically the act of improvisation, and how do you define the act of improvisation? Is it making music in time, or I'm almost curious if when you're improvising, if you're aware of some sort of form. I guess this question is more about improvisation and form. If when you're improvising, what you do now, does that affect what you might do 30 seconds from then, or an hour from then, or does that make sense? How does that work? Are you in the minute when you're improvising and you're devoid of what came before and what might possibly come next?
I think it's very complex, of course, and not always the same. But you asked me what I think improvising is, and I think very simply that improvising is making stuff up. And that's pretty much the beginning and the end of it. On what particular plane you're making stuff up changes quite a bit. So in the moment, yes, ideally, but also one does, you know, sometimes start hearing form in an unlikely way. So since all time-based media involve memory, and music is all about memory, there's a sense in which your memory of this particular performance might become specific enough that you reprise something that you've already done, although that, in my experience, that's not necessarily the best way to go. But I think the interaction, it's very different playing solo from playing with other people, and playing with two is very different from playing with three, and I think after three it's kind of a lottery anyway. So my sense is that my favorite form right now is trios, and I feel like I'm on top of it. I've really understood trios, and I like it a lot because it's always one and two. It's seldom three, and sometimes it's three ones. But there's always a kind of a dynamic which is very interesting between the three, which creates a tension that you don't get in the same way with two. And I often find that two, the danger is that you're too complicit, and I like the two ones as much as I like the two. And when you get to four, something happens which I have not yet figured out. And five, I prefer to four, and in any case, I don't expect to be on top of either before I die, but I'm working on it. And certainly, obviously, big group improvisation involves having to have some kind of external form mechanism for it to make any sense, otherwise it's always a mess. And there's a whole area of big group improvising structure which I'm kind of fascinated by how it's evolved in different ways. So you can look at Zorn's game pieces, or Braxton's kind of notation, or Leo Smith's kind of notation, or Butch Morris's conduction, or my graphic scores, or, you know, there's a whole area of music which is intended to constrict and reduce the possibilities in order to make something work. But if you're talking about just the mechanism of improvising in the moment with a couple of people, then I think the idea about form is enormously variable, and sometimes you're more aware of it than other times. And I don't know how important it is in the end, because if you're really in the moment, things are flowing in a way that you never even think about anything anyway. You're just going for it. And I think it's only when you listen back that it becomes something else. And the whole thing about recording, which is the history of which has, in a way, enabled the development of improvised music forms. You can't really look at the history of jazz without understanding that it was enabled by recording. It was the first time that you could study what people were doing and, you know, actually note for note play a Charlie Parker solo because it was right there on the record and you could play it. That's where that evolution comes from, but it also means something negative for me, which is that as soon as you hear a performance back, it becomes a composition in a way which is not necessarily going to be telling you what the strength of that moment was. And I don't think a recording of an improvisation is actually telling the truth of what happened when you were actually there. And as we all know from experience, a really bad performance can sound fantastic on a recording. And vice versa, you can think, I really played my ass off tonight, and then you listen to the recording and think, what was I thinking, you know?
Thank you.
Could you mention your conscious influences generally, particularly in the early part of your career?
Conscious influences. I think the easiest way to answer that question is to say that I really believe that the biggest influences you have throughout your career are the people that you work with. Of course, you know, you get drawn to this and that and the other, and I could give you a blackboard full of names, all of which would have some, you know, direct reference to what I've been doing, and it might be names as varied as Davy Graham on the one hand, and, you know, Miles Davis on the other, and Indian music on the other, and so on and so on and so on and so on. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to influence, I'm probably much more influenced by Chris Cutler, or Zena Parkins, or Ikue Mori, or John Zorn, or any of the people that I work with regularly, because there's an interchange involved where it gets under your skin and you start to understand your own work differently. And that kind of energy exchange is really the biggest and most important influence that happens, and that's the influence I crave all the time, so that's why I work with those people.
Have you ever done any work with spoken word artists? And what's your take on that?
Spoken word artists.
Yeah, like,
meaning,
well, improvising a stream of consciousness poetry,
oh,
and how that relates to improvisation in musical film.
very little, and what I've done was a long time ago. I've improvised with Peter Blackbird, improvising, for example, in the 80s. And I was kind of interested in sound poetry in the 70s, Bob Cumming and people like that. So I did see some performances of that, but I never actually played with them. But I think probably the closest I would be likely to get to that would be someone like Maggie Nichols, who's, even though she's not technically a text sound person, she uses text all the time in her improvised work and uses it in a fairly dangerous way. So that would be something I could imagine getting involved with. But I can't say I'm particularly drawn to it. I'm a songwriter, so I like working with text from a compositional point of view, but improvising with text strikes me as being as dangerous, at least for me, as improvising with dance, which I also find very problematic. And I do a lot of work with choreographers, and I do a lot of composing for choreographers, but I have fairly extensive experience of improvising with dancers that I usually hate it. And I find that the way that I can work with it best is to make sure that I'm not looking. And actually, that may sound perverse, but I think the reason for it is that there's a certain sense in which the way that we respond to visual stimuli tends to be more banal in a way. So if I see a dancer doing something, I tend to react to it, and if I make a sound, the dancer reacts to it, and it becomes extremely one-dimensional. And if I'm not looking at what the dancer is doing, they're just in the same kind of Merce Cunningham, John Cage kind of separation kind of way. With improvising, it seems to be the same. It's much richer if I can follow my own narrative path and the dancer follows theirs, and something happens, and then people come up after it and say, wow, all that rehearsal you must have done. So you know that something was going on between you, and at the same time it's not kind of reduced in the way that reactive playing and dancing is reduced.
What about when you're then when you're then writing for dance as opposed to improvising with dance? I'm assuming you will be looking in that kind of circumstance. How do you?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Again, from long experience, I've come to be very reticent about working with choreographers who work from the basis of a shopping list. And there are choreographers who will do that, who come to you and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and this part I need something here, which would be great if you had some strings in it, and then I'd like a little bit of saxophone here, and then we're going to have some silence there, and then we're going to do this, and I'm like, hold on. If you want to write the music, you don't need me. I need the space myself to be able to imagine, just as they need the space to be able to imagine. And then from the other point of view, I've learned to reduce, because my early work with choreography was way too emotionally dense. And there was no space for the dancers to breathe in that kind of emotional atmosphere, so I've had to learn how to back off. But generally speaking, I work regularly with a small group of choreographers I've been working with for a long time. And I'm very resistant to working with new ones unless I kind of feel that there's a certain way of working together which we can develop. And that way of working together is very much to do with the starting point. And the starting point has not got to be about what the music is going to sound like, or what instruments are going to be involved, or how long the sections are going to be, or any of those practical things, which we can get to later. What it has to be about for me is what's the philosophical starting point of the piece. What are we reading? What have we been looking at lately? What are our ideas about with regard to life in general, as opposed to movement and sound? And then out of that, we can usually find a starting point. And often we'll start and go and work on our own for a while, and then start sending each other ideas, and then it'll start to evolve like that. So there's no dictation to me about what I'm supposed to be writing, and I'm not telling her how she should be choreographing either. But later we may comment on each other's work in a helpful way, hopefully, but not at the beginning.